Hello. I want to start in a bit of an unusual place today. I want to start with the woman of Proverbs 31. The 10th verse of that chapter says, "A wife of noble character, who can find?" Now, lots of people think Proverbs 31 is a list of what wives ought to do, a list of chores for us. And it's a pretty overwhelming passage. I don't know if you've ever read it and just absolutely hated this person who is so perfect because you feel you can't live up to it. But that's really not what Proverbs 31 is about. Proverbs, the whole book, is about wisdom. And wisdom throughout the book is personified as a woman. So too, in fact, is a lack of wisdom, foolishness. There's the wise woman and the foolish woman. And then there's the adulterous woman and the woman of noble character. And the woman of noble character and the adulterous woman are used as examples of what it looks like in our lives when we have either a lack of wisdom, a lack of the knowledge of God in the adulterous woman, or we are living, wisdom lived is shown as the Proverbs 31 woman, a woman of noble character. And so it's not a checklist for our lives. It's not a list of things that your husband can expect you to do. In fact, it isn't even a chapter just for women. It is about what it looks like when wisdom is lived. And the reason I'm starting with Proverbs 31 is that this woman is called a woman of noble character. And that phrase, noble character, is used one other place in the Old Testament outside of Proverbs, and that's in the book of Ruth. And I'm going to jump ahead for a reason, for a second here, into Ruth chapter 3. In verse 11 of chapter 3, Boaz says to Ruth, "We all know you are a woman of noble character." Ruth is not a wife. She is not a mother. She does not have servants to provide for or to manage. She does not have the ability to sell a field or plant a vineyard, which the woman of Proverbs 31 does. But she has a similar character, and her character is the primary subject of Ruth chapter 2. You might need to use some air quotes in a couple of places in this chapter today. Things just happen. We might also need one of those, little thought clouds with a light bulb in it that you see in cartoon drawings, because if there is a light bulb moment, God is really at work in chapter 2, and Naomi has a light bulb moment. Ruth doesn't see it. No one yet has any idea exactly what God is going to do, but Naomi starts to get a bit of an inkling. The chapter begins with a bit of information. Naomi has a relative on her husband's side of the family who lives locally, and his name is Boaz. Verse 2 shows us why Ruth came to Bethlehem with Naomi, and also tells us a bit about what their financial situation is like. They have to go and glean in the fields for the food that they are going to eat. They can't go and buy it. They are the poorest of the poor. And Ruth says to Naomi, "Let me go out and glean, picking up the leftover grain in the fields of anyone who is favorable towards me." Now, Ruth has come with Naomi just for this reason, to do the backbreaking work of gathering their food. She wants to take care of Naomi. She has a generous heart. The practice of gleaning has its root in the law. Leviticus 19, 9-10 says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien." The poor had a really rough time of it in the ancient world. There was no social assistance. There were no, provisions. There was no welfare offering. And so this practice of allowing the poor and the alien to glean in the fields was commanded by God as a way for the poor to be supplied with food. You were not to reap to the edges for every bit of your harvest. You were not to go over it again for what you missed the first time. If you dropped a few stalks of grain or a cluster of grapes, you were to leave it there to lie for the poor. Not everyone followed this command, and not everyone was willing to allow the poor to glean in their fields. God commanded it, but not everyone did it. So Ruth needed a place where someone would be favorable towards her. So Naomi tells her to go. And she goes out and she begins to glean. Verse 3, in the middle of the verse, it said, as it turned out, and you need air quotes around that, it just so happened not. I think the author was tongue-in-cheek when he said that it just so happened, or it turned out this way. This is one place where God is moving. The author knows that, for he has taken the trouble to tell us that this man Boaz is a relative of Naomi's. God directed Ruth in some way to the field of Boaz. Now, I don't know what you discern about Boaz for this chapter, but he is a God-fearing man. He's also highly respected. His foreman respects him and knows him well enough to be able to know that he would allow Ruth to glean in the field even when Boaz was not there to ask. He knows Boaz is a man who would allow the poor to do this. And we're going to see that he is a generous man, although some of his generosity may not appear easily to us without the cultural context that we'll talk about in a minute. So Ruth is working away, and she's been there for some hours when Boaz shows up to his field. Now, Bethlehem is a small place, not at all big. Strangers would be noticed. So he sees Ruth and he knows she's not one of his hired servants, nor does he recognize her. And he asks his foreman who she is, and the foreman said, she is the Moabitess. This is the second time in the chapter where her origins are mentioned. The first time is back in verse 2, where it says, Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi. So the foreman identifies her as being from Moab too, but he has lots of good things to say about her and her work. She has asked to glean, she's worked hard all morning and only had one short rest. Boaz has heard of her, and he goes over to talk to her. He calls her daughter, and he tells her not to go into another field to glean, but to stay with his servant girls and follow them. Fields in the ancient world were divided by boundary stones, and there were stones that were placed along the edges between two pieces of property to mark the boundaries of a field. In the tall green or the weeds, it would be easy to miss the stones and to wander accidentally across into someone else's field. And if that person was not willing for the poor to glean in their field, or if they had bad intentions toward a young woman that was on her own, then she could be in danger. And so the suggestion of Boaz was for her safety. He says he commands his men to leave her alone, and he says she can also drink from the water jugs the men have filled. Now, this doesn't sound like much to us, but this is an act of kindness. There is no source of water out in the fields. You either brought your own or the master brought it for his workers. And that involves some significant hard work. These big stone water jugs had to be transported out to the field, and then the water had to be pulled up from the well and carried out to the field, and the stone jugs had to be filled. So many man hours went into filling them to allow a person who is not working for you, but is actually taking free grain from your field to drink the water, is an act of kindness. Ruth recognizes how kind Boaz is being to her, and she bows down. She asks him why. He has shown her such favor because she is a foreigner. This is the third reference in the chapter to Ruth's foreignness, and here she mentions it herself. Ruth recognizes how kind Boaz is being to her, and she understands that he is going out of his way. She sees that her foreignness it marks her as someone who is not worthy of his kindness, and yet he is showing it to her anyway. In verse 11, Boaz begins to say what he's heard about Ruth, and he emphasizes her kindness to Naomi that made him show her kindness. He says he's heard what she has done for Naomi and ties that to the fact that she left her home and she came to live in Bethlehem. It does not say it directly, but I think we can infer that Ruth has come for the purpose of caring for Naomi. She came to help her to do the hard work of gleaning and to care for her mother-in-law. She is not expecting to get anything out of her life in Bethlehem for herself. Boaz knows this, and he's impressed by it. And Boaz has seen the character of Ruth, even though she just arrived. and he's complimentary. Verse 13 made me laugh a little bit. Boaz says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." This is in essence a prayer for Ruth, and God is going to answer it. He's going to use Boaz to answer this prayer, and Boaz has no idea at all. I think this is one of the truths about how God blesses us that we find in this book. When God lays it on our hearts about something that we want God to do, often God is going to make us a part of the answer to the prayer. If something is on your heart, some ministry you would like to see happen, someone you want God to bless in a specific way, ask God how he wants you to be a part of that. You might be the answer to the prayer you are praying for someone else. Sometimes we get an idea for a ministry or a need and we say, the church should do that. And God says, no, you should do. Ruth is grateful for the kindness of Boaz. And he's not done showing kindness to her that day. At lunch, he asks her over to eat with his servants. And when she sat down, he gave her some roasted grain. Now, this would have been either food that he is providing for his servants, or it was his own lunch. And he is sharing it with her. She gets to eat all she wants, and she even gets to take the leftovers with her. And it seems implied that she had no food with her to eat. When she goes back to work, Boaz gives orders to his workers. They are to let her alone to glean wherever she wishes. She is allowed, under Old Testament law, to glean along the edges of the field and in the corners, but he says, even if she goes among the standing sheaves, just let her do it. Don't embarrass her. And in fact, drop some extra for her. Make it easy for her to get a lot of grain. So then it says, Ruth worked until evening, and then she threshed the grain. Now, threshing is beating the heads of the grain onto the hard packed earth called a threshing floor to get the grain out of the stalks. She then had to gather it up and she took it home with her. And verse 17 said it was about an ephah. I have a footnote in my Bible that kind of blew my mind. It says that's about 3/5 of a bushel, or about 22 liters. 22 liters of grain. When you think that she has gathered all of that in one day, that is a huge amount of work, long hours of bending and picking it up bit by bit and then banging it all on the ground to release the grain. It gave me two pictures. First is the picture of the sheer amount of work this was. And the other was the grace that is shown to Ruth for her to be able to gather that much in one day. Naomi's blown away by the amount of grain Ruth has brought home. Ruth also gives to Naomi the leftover grain of what she had eaten at lunch. And Naomi asks where she has gone to glean and blesses the person who took notice of her. And Ruth said, it's in the field of a man named Boaz. And I think if this story were portrayed as a cartoon drawing, this would have been the moment with the little light bulb in the thought cloud above the head of Naomi. I think Naomi begins to think about possibilities right here. The first thing Naomi says is to ask a blessing on Boaz. The second is to praise God for the kindness he is showing them. Naomi sees the providential care of God in the events of this day. Then she makes a comment about how the wheels are turning in her head. Verse 20, the last part of the verse says, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. The NIV says kinsman redeemer. Not all versions do. Some just say he's one of our kinsmen. So I want to stop a minute here and explain what a kinsman redeemer is and what qualifies a person to be one. In Leviticus 25, 27, and then verse 49, it tells us a bit about the process of redeeming land or people. If a person had debts and they cannot pay them, they could sell their land to pay their debts. And if they were really destitute, they might even sell themselves into slavery in order to use money to pay off debts, plus put a roof over their head and food in their own stomachs. The person who sold themselves as a slave or the land sold for debts could be redeemed. They were eligible for redemption. And there were 3 qualifications for the person who could redeem a slave or land. The first is the person must be a relative. The redeemer must be a relative. The second is the redeemer must be able to pay the cost involved with buying back the slave out of slavery and buying back the land. And the third is that this is voluntary. No one could force a person to redeem another person or their land. Because of the fact that the one who redeems was a relative, this became known as a kinsman redeemer. The redemption of the person or the land was an act of generosity and kindness because there's nothing in it for the one who redeems. The redeemer would pay to buy the person from slavery, but then set them free. Or they would pay to buy back the land from the person who bought it and then give it back to its original owner. It was a total act of grace and generosity. The redeemer gets nothing. Naomi has realized that this man Boaz was not only a relative, but he's qualified to be a kinsman redeemer, at least in that he is closely related and he has enough money to pay the debt because he is a wealthy man. What she could not have known at this point is if he would be willing. But his generosity to Ruth is pretty encouraging. And I think Naomi had a light bulb moment and the wheels started to turn in her head. So she encourages Ruth to continue in Boaz's fields. If nothing else, he will keep her safe. Chapter 2 ends with a verse of general information that we often just pass right over. It says, "So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law." God's been working behind the scenes in the life of Ruth. God is moving. We can see it. Naomi sees it, and she seems to think God is moving, but Ruth doesn't know anything yet about what God's doing. It might seem as if God, having begun to work, would immediately rescue Ruth and Naomi from their abject grinding poverty. But no, Ruth does not get a break from the back-breaking work day in and day out of gleaning. She gleans for weeks throughout the barley harvest and throughout the wheat harvest. God does not jump in and rescue them right away. He's working, but not at supersonic speed. I think that God left this time of Ruth working like this to demonstrate the depth of her character by her consistent effort on behalf of her mother-in-law. Her faithfulness to what she felt called to do for Naomi is clearly shown through these weeks of hard labor. So one of the lessons in this chapter is about how God blesses. He often requires us to be faithful where he has put us before he will bless us with better or before he calls us into something else. God very much values our faithfulness, and Ruth shows it in spades. She was expecting years of this sort of grinding work, and she's not shying away from it. She just goes to work day after day and provides for Naomi and for herself. God requires this time of her faithfulness before he steps in and does more for her. It should make us evaluate where God has put us to be faithful in less than ideal circumstances. How are you doing? If we kick against the circumstances instead of buckling down and doing the hard work God has given us in the moment, why should he call us forward into blessing or into a greater responsibility? In addition, while outward circumstances may not change for a time, God is still at work in our hearts. That is his primary interest, and sometimes troubling times externally make for massive progress in our godliness and character development. Character really shows up in this chapter. Ruth has steadfast commitment, integrity to what she felt called to do, faithfulness in the hard slog, and God's going to honor that. And Boaz has kindness and generosity. He has perception to see how kind Ruth is and prays that God will bless her, not knowing that he is going to be the answer to that prayer. Both of them show what chapter 3 will call noble character. God is going to give both of them great gifts in the upcoming days. Their lifestyles of patient and consistent godliness, doing what is right in God's eyes, doing what they felt called to do, is an example of how we are to live our lives. No matter if we are like Boaz, living in wealth, or like Ruth, living in poverty, there is a place for good character. Boaz chooses to be generous, to do what the law said, to allow the poor to glean in the fields, but to go farther and actively help her gather lots of grain. Ruth was plodding faithfully along on the hard work she had been given to do, and she was doing it with a great attitude and with awe at the kindness being shown to her. She's appreciative of the little bits of generosity, even in their lack. 3 times in chapter 2, Ruth is called the Moabitess. And once she calls herself a foreigner. You can check it out in verses 2, 6, 10, and 21. And yet this foreigner who has come to trust in God is exhibiting godly character. There is no one from any background that God cannot change into his character. She is showing godly character in spite of her pagan background. And in spite of her foreignness, God is showing her grace, even while she does this backbreaking work. God is moving. He is going to change circumstances, but first, he is refining character. How is he refining yours today? And where is he working to change you so you are ready for greater things?